They pointed guns at me on my own land, right there at the threshold of my lake cabin, the one my grandfather built with his own hands, timber by timber, memory by memory. They called themselves OA police, a ludicrous designation for a gaggle of weekend warriors, drunk on a thimbleful of imaginary power. Their ill-fitting surplus store tactical vests and mismatched sidearms, a Glock here, a dubious Smith Wesson knockoff there, were almost comical, if not for the muzzles wavering in my direction. They had no idea who they were posturing for, no inkling of the hornet's nest they were kicking. One of them, a portly man whose face was a roadmap of broken capillaries and self-importance, puffed out his chest. "This is a final notice, sir. You're in violation of HOA covenants, Section 7, Subsection B, Paragraph 4, unauthorized aesthetic modifications. You've been warned. We're here to ensure you vacate the premises. Kick you out, if you prefer blunter terms." His voice, a gravelly baritone, tried for authority, but only achieved a strained belligerence. I remained still, hands visible, my gaze sweeping over them, cataloging each weapon, each nervous tick, each flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. My mind, a machine honed by years of far more serious confrontations, began its cold calculus. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an assertion of dominance by fools, and I had a very low tolerance for armed fools trespassing on my private property. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the even thicker stench of their arrogance. They thought they were the law here, in this secluded corner of the county. They'd soon learn about jurisdiction, about actual authority, about the profound mistake of threatening a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the very laws they were so gleefully trampling. My cabin, my sanctuary, was not going to be defiled by their petty tyranny. This wasn't just about a fresh coat of paint or an unapproved bird feeder. This was about a fundamental violation, a line crossed with an astonishing degree of entitled recklessness. The lead idiot, let's call him President Pompous, took another step, his cheap holster creaking. "Don't make this difficult. We have the authority." He patted his holstered weapon, a gesture meant to intimidate, but which only underscored his amateurism. A real professional doesn't telegraph. A real professional doesn't need to. They were about to receive a practical and very memorable lesson in professional conduct, one that would echo far beyond the serene shores of this lake. The first domino was about to fall, set in motion by their own monumental stupidity. I could almost hear the click of the tumblers aligning in the lock of their impending doom. This initial harassment, this pathetic attempt to kick me out, was merely the overture to an opera of their own tragic composition. They were writing the libretto with every misstep, every puffed-up pronouncement, and I was preparing to conduct the final, thunderous act. The Quiet Woods were about to witness a very specific, very personal form of justice. The demand to vacate my private property, my lake cabin, was not a request. It was an ultimatum, delivered with the smug certainty of those who have never faced real consequences. President Pompous, emboldened by the silence I'd maintained, a silence he misinterpreted as fear rather than focused assessment, gestured with his chin toward the dirt driveway. "You have 1 hour to gather your personal effects and leave. After that, anything left on this private property becomes property of the Homeowners Association, per Bylaw 15. Consider yourself served with an eviction notice." An eviction notice from him. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. He held up a crumpled piece of paper, likely something he'd printed off a cut-rate legal website, thinking it a shield and a sword. This was the moral violation, the point where their ludicrous power fantasy tipped into actionable illegality. They weren't just citing bogus rules about the precise shade of forest green I'd used to repaint the shutters. They were threatening to dispossess me, to seize my land, my heritage. With their makeshift HOA cops as the enforcers, the line wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated with a swaggering, ignorant boot. My internal monologue, usually a calm stream of tactical considerations, now had an undercurrent of cold, hard fury. These men, with their toy badges and their very real guns, were attempting a strong-arm eviction, a blatant act of trespassing coupled with coercion. The weapon each of them carried wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of their perceived impunity, a dangerous delusion I was bound to shatter. One of the younger ones, clearly uncomfortable, shifted his weight. "Look, mister, we don't want any trouble. Just comply." His voice lacked the conviction of his leader. He was a follower, caught in the undertow of a stronger, more malignant will. But complicity has a price. I could see my grandfather's face in my mind's eye, the pride he took in this cabin, the sweat and love poured into every beam. This wasn't just wood and stone, it was legacy. And these clowns were threatening to defile it, to kick me out, as if I were some squatter, some transient, rather than the rightful owner. A man who had sworn an oath to protect citizens from precisely this kind of thuggery. President Pompous actually smirked. "Don't think you can call anyone. We are the authority here." The local police department? They know better than to interfere with HOA matters. This is private property, governed by our rules. His ignorance was a weapon pointed at his own head. He genuinely believed his little fiefdom was untouchable, that his HOA police had some standing. The moral fabric of the situation was tearing, and through that tear, I saw the path to their undoing. This was no longer petty harassment. It was a direct assault on my rights, my home, and the rule of law itself. My calm was the stillness before a storm, a calculated pause before the surgical strike. They had presented their terms, now I would present mine, and mine would be non-negotiable, backed not by bluster, but by the full weight of the authority they so arrogantly dismissed. The air crackled, not with their manufactured tension, but with the impending impact of reality. The moment of revelation was, I confess, intensely satisfying. President Pompous was mid-sentence, something about final warnings and consequences, when I raised a hand, a simple gesture that nevertheless cut him off. My voice, when I finally spoke, was devoid of heat, a flat, level tone that carried more weight than all their bluster. "Gentlemen," I began, my eyes locking onto Pompous, then flicking to each of his flunkies. "There seems to be a significant misunderstanding here regarding authority and jurisdiction. I let that hang for a beat. You are currently trespassing on private property. You are armed. You have made credible threats of illegal eviction and seizure of property. You are impersonating law enforcement officers, which, I assure you, the actual police department takes a very dim view of." Pompous scoffed. "Impersonating? We are the duly authorized HOA security patrol." He tapped his cheap plastic badge. "Now, are you going to leave, or do we physically remove you?" This was it. The pivot. "Actually," I said, reaching slowly inside my jacket, my movements deliberate, non-threatening but precise. "I don't think any of you are in a position to remove anyone." I produced my badge, the gleaming five-pointed star of the county sheriff, Sheriff Thomas Ashton, Rockwood County. "And you, sir," I said, my gaze drilling into Pompous, "are under arrest for armed trespassing, coercion, and impersonating an officer of the law, as are your associates." The transformation on their faces was cinematic. Pompous's jaw literally dropped, his ruddy complexion turning a pasty white. The bravado evaporated like mist on a hot morning. The younger one who'd looked uneasy now looked terrified. Another, a wiry fellow who'd been trying to look tough, took an involuntary step back, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. "Don't," I commanded, my voice now carrying the unmistakable ring of authority I seldom had to fully unleash in civilian life. "Don't even think about it. Hands where I can see them." Slowly. My training kicked in, a seamless flow of action and command. "You," I pointed to the wiry one. "Drop your weapon, now." He hesitated, eyes darting. That hesitation could get someone killed. "I will not ask again. Drop the gun. You are not trained for this. You do not want to see what happens if you make a bad decision right now. There will be no shooting unless you force it." The word shooting hung heavy. He dropped the gun with a clatter. "Good." The others, seeing their alpha crumble and their cohort disarmed by sheer force of will and the weight of a real badge, began to lose their nerve entirely. Two of them, the ones furthest from Pompous, turned and fled, scrambling back up the driveway like frightened deer. They were afraid I'd shoot them, and in their panic, they abandoned their leader and their so-called mission. Pompous and the now disarmed wiry one remained, looking utterly defeated. "On your knees! Hands behind your heads!" My voice was cold steel. They complied. I secured Pompous first, then his remaining minion, using the flex cuffs I always carried. The arrest was by the book. Clean. Efficient. The power dynamic had shifted with the speed of a striking snake. The HOA police were no more. The county's sheriff had arrived, and order, true order, was being restored to his lake cabin. This was just the beginning of their education. With President Pompous and his one remaining, thoroughly demoralized HOA cop secured, I made the call. The familiar cadence of dispatch answered, and I requested uniformed deputies and a detective unit to my location at the lake cabin. 10-4, Sheriff. Units en route. The calm professionalism on the other end of the radio was a stark, welcome contrast to the chaotic amateur hour I'd just shut down. While waiting, I conducted a preliminary sweep of the area, ensuring the two who had fled hadn't circled back or posed any further immediate threat. My private property was now an active crime scene, an irony not lost on me. The trespassing was blatant, the weapons brandished, the threats unambiguous. This wasn't a simple dispute over lawn gnome placement. This was a criminal enterprise masquerading as community governance. My deputies arrived first, lights painting the trees in brief flashes of red and blue. They were professionals, their demeanor serious, their movements practiced. Sergeant Miller, a good man I'd worked with for 15 years, took in the scene. Me, calm. Two individuals cuffed on the ground, a dropped sidearm. "Trouble at the cabin, Sheriff?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "You could say that, Miller. These gentlemen were attempting to kick me out under the guise of HOA authority." They were armed and disinclined to listen to reason. I gave him the short version. His eyes hardened. He knew what impersonating an officer meant, especially when combined with firearms and threats. The detective, a sharp young woman named Ramirez, arrived shortly after. She began the meticulous process of documenting the scene, photographing the dropped weapon, the bogus eviction notice Pompous had brandished, the makeshift HOA police badges. I provided my statement, a dispassionate account of the events, focusing on their actions, their words, the clear violations of state law. The illegal nature of their endeavor was becoming painfully clear even to them as they sat in the back of separate patrol cars. Pompous, I noted with a certain grim satisfaction, was attempting to argue with the deputy processing him, still clinging to shreds of his imagined authority. It wouldn't do him any good. The system he had tried to pervert was now closing in on him. My internal state had shifted from the cold fury of a man defending his home to the focused intensity of the county sheriff responsible for upholding the law for everyone. This wasn't personal anymore. Not entirely. This was about dismantling a corrupt structure that had clearly terrorized others. If they were bold enough to pull this on me, the actual sheriff, what had they been doing to ordinary residents who lacked my resources and authority? The thought was a cold stone in my gut. The investigation was just beginning. This initial arrest, this confrontation at my lake cabin, was merely the tip of a very ugly iceberg. The weapons were secured, the immediate threat neutralized, but the rot within this HOA needed to be excised with surgical precision. The police department, my police department would uncover the full extent of their illegal activities. The initial arrests at my lake cabin were merely the prologue. Once pompous, real name Arthur Jenkins, and his accomplice were booked, I initiated a full-scale investigation into the Willow Creek Bluffs Homeowners Association. This wasn't just about their armed trespass on my private property. My gut told me that level of brazenness was born from a long history of unchecked power and likely illegal activity. I assigned Detective Ramirez as lead, but I made it clear this was a priority for the sheriff's office. We would dig. We would find whatever lurked beneath the surface of their meticulously manicured lawns and restrictive covenants. This is where my sidekick, if you could call him that, entered the picture. Not a traditional partner, but an invaluable asset nonetheless. Binary Bill Conroy was a former NSA analyst who'd cashed out, moved to our quiet county for reasons he never fully articulated, and now ran a small, unassuming cybersecurity firm. He also happened to be a neighbor, living just outside the HOA's jurisdiction, and had a long-standing, deeply amused contempt for their petty tyrannies. I called Bill. "Got a project for you, Bill, something that requires a delicate touch with digital breadcrumbs. HOA, Willow Creek Bluffs." There was a chuckle on the other end. "Say no more, Sheriff. Those tin pot dictators? Been waiting for someone to finally shine a light on their little empire. What do you need?" I needed everything. Financial records, email communications, internal memos, complaints filed against them that mysteriously disappeared. I suspected embezzlement, intimidation, misuse of funds, the usual trifecta when unchecked power meets greed. Bill, with his almost supernatural ability to navigate the labyrinth of servers and encrypted files, was the perfect man to unearth the HOA's digital skeletons. While Bill worked his magic in the ones and zeros, Ramirez and her team started interviewing other residents of Willow Creek Bluffs. Initially, people were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. The HOA, under Jenkins's reign, had cultivated an atmosphere of fear. Late fees for imaginary infractions, liens placed on properties for trivial matters, constant threats to kick people out or saddle them with crippling fines. But as word spread that the county sheriff himself was investigating, that Jenkins was actually arrested, a few brave souls began to talk. Then a few more. The dam of silence was cracking. Stories emerged of Jenkins using HOA funds for personal expenses, of him strong-arming elderly residents into costly, unnecessary property modifications performed by companies owned by his cronies. There were whispers of rigged board elections, of dissenting voices being systematically silenced. The scope of their illegal operations was far greater than I'd initially imagined. This wasn't just a rogue HOA police force. It was a borderline criminal syndicate preying on its own community. The deeper we dug, the uglier it became. The veneer of respectability was flaking away, revealing a core of pure, unadulterated corruption. The evidence was starting to pile up, a testament to years of their belief that they were above the law, untouchable within their little fiefdom. They had exposed themselves with their arrogance, and now we were meticulously gathering the pieces to ensure they faced a reckoning. The digital dragnet cast by Binary Bill began to yield a rich harvest. Encrypted spreadsheets detailing discretionary spending that led directly to Jenkins's personal accounts. Chains of emails where Jenkins and his inner circle plotted to target specific homeowners who had dared to question their authority, complete with draft violation notices for infractions that were demonstrably false. There were scanned invoices from phantom companies for services never rendered, the funds invariably rerouted. It was a textbook case of embezzlement and fraud, laid out with an almost arrogant lackability of sophisticated concealment. They truly believed no one would ever look. Detective Ramirez, meanwhile, was a force of nature with the paper trail. She subpoenaed bank records, cross-referencing them with the HOA's declared financials. The discrepancies were glaring. She unearthed property records, showing liens placed under questionable circumstances, often leading to forced sales where associates of Jenkins conveniently acquired properties below market value. The legal filings they'd used to intimidate residents were often improperly filed, full of procedural errors, or based on bylaws that were themselves of dubious legality or had been altered without proper member consent. We found a pattern of targeting, often older residents or those perceived as less likely to fight back. The sheer volume of documentation was staggering. We had boxes of it: bank statements, forged meeting minutes, threatening letters signed by Jenkins, internal HOA emails discussing how to handle problematic residents. Each piece of paper was a nail in their coffin. My office began to resemble a war room. Maps of the Willow Creek Bluff subdivision pinned to boards, timelines of financial transactions, webs of connections between Jenkins, his board members, and the companies benefiting from their schemes. The visual cues were damning: highlighted lines on bank statements showing transfers to offshore accounts, zoom-ins on forged signatures on HOA documents, printouts of text messages where they gloated about their power. The weight of evidence was becoming crushing. I remember one particular document Bill decrypted, a memo from Jenkins to his security chief, the same portly man who'd first confronted me, explicitly outlining a strategy to use escalating fines and threats of eviction to force a retired schoolteacher, Mrs. Henderson, from her home because she had complained about a special assessment. The memo detailed how they would manufacture violations, how they would drown her in paperwork and legal threats until she gave up. It was cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of humanity. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, the petty, cruel power to dominate and control. The weapon they wielded wasn't always a gun. Often it was the threat of financial ruin, the slow, grinding pressure of bureaucratic malice. The violation notices they'd plastered on doors were instruments of terror. We were building an ironclad case, not just against Jenkins, but against several key members of his HOA board. The legally lethal approach was taking shape. Each piece of evidence, a carefully aimed shot. The momentum was ours. The facade of the Willow Creek Bluffs HOA was crumbling, revealing the rotten core within. Their reign of error was drawing to a close, not with a bang, but with the rustle of incriminating paper. The time came to confront Arthur Jenkins directly, not as the blustering HOA president at my lake cabin, but as a suspect in a widening criminal investigation. Seated in the sterile environment of an interview room at the sheriff's department, he'd posted bail on the initial charges, a fact that irked me but was procedurally correct. This, however, was a different conversation. Detective Ramirez and I sat opposite him. The arrogance was still there, but frayed around the edges, a cheap suit showing its wear. He had his lawyer with him, a slick, apathetic man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I let Ramirez lead. Her style was methodical, almost gentle, which often lulled suspects into a false sense of security. She laid out the initial findings, focusing on financial irregularities, the discrepancies in the HOA's books. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, her voice calm, "we've found some anomalies in the association's accounts. Large sums transferred to entities that don't seem to exist, or that trace back to personal accounts, including yours." Jenkins scoffed, a practiced sound. "Bookkeeping errors, perhaps. My treasurer handles the day-to-day. I'm a busy man." His gaze flickered to his lawyer, seeking reassurance that wasn't forthcoming. The lawyer just sighed, a tiny, almost imperceptible exhalation of defeat. Then it was my turn. My approach was less gentle. "Mr. Jenkins," I said, my voice flat, "we're past bookkeeping errors. We have evidence of systematic fraud, embezzlement, and a conspiracy to defraud the members of your HOA. We have your emails, Mr. Jenkins. We have your memos. We have sworn affidavits from numerous victims of your schemes." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "We have the memo regarding Mrs. Henderson, for instance. The one where you detail how you plan to illegally force an elderly widow from her home. The blood drained from Jenkins's face. His eyes, for the first time, showed genuine fear, not the bluster of a bully, but the stark terror of a man seeing the walls close in. His lawyer cleared his throat. My client has nothing further to say at this time. But the damage was done. Jenkins's carefully constructed facade of the benevolent, if strict, community leader had shattered. He was exposed not just as a petty tyrant, but as a common thief. The monologue I'd been running in my head, the one about justice and accountability, was now playing out in reality. This wasn't about poetic justice for me personally anymore. This was about dismantling a corrupt system that had preyed on the vulnerable. His HOA cops were a symptom of his delusion, a belief that he operated in a realm beyond the reach of actual law enforcement. He was about to learn in the most definitive way possible that no one is above the law in my county. The terse, cold, tactical dialogue had served its purpose. It had set the trap, and Jenkins had walked right into it. His own words, his own actions, now the bars of his impending cage. The jail time he was facing was significant, not just for the initial confrontation, but for the years of systematic plunder. The narcissistic and delusional antagonist was finally facing the unblinking gaze of consequence. The satisfaction was grim but profound. The public reckoning was swift and brutal, just as it should be for those who betray public trust, even the quasi-public trust of an HOA. We didn't need a dramatic press conference initially. Instead, information began to disseminate through official channels and then, inevitably, to the local press. The initial spark was the news of Jenkins's arrest at my cabin, which raised eyebrows. But when the subsequent charges were filed, racketeering, multiple counts of felony fraud, embezzlement, elder abuse, the story exploded. The silent majority of Willow Creek Bluffs residents, those who had lived under Jenkins' thumb, found their voice. A town hall meeting, originally scheduled by the remaining panicked HOA board members to try and control the narrative, turned into a public crucifixion. Detective Ramirez and I attended not to interfere, but to observe and ensure public order. One by one, residents stood up, their voices shaking with years of suppressed anger and fear, detailing their own horror stories. An elderly man spoke of being fined into near bankruptcy over the color of his mailbox. A young couple recounted how Jenkins had used the HOA to block the sale of their house to a family he disapproved of. Mrs. HOAWW Henderson, frail but resolute, her voice surprisingly strong, told the assembled crowd and the news cameras that were now present about the campaign of harassment she had endured. Her testimony was damning. The on-screen text of news headlines flashed across local channels. OA, President arrested, faces fraud charges. Willow Creek Bluffs, scandal deepens. Sheriff uncovers years of corruption in local HOA. Text messages and emails, carefully redacted to protect ongoing investigations but clear in their incriminating content, were leaked or officially released, painting a vivid picture of Jenkins's avarice and abuse of power. The arrest warrants for other board members involved in the conspiracy were executed publicly, a clear message that the entire rotten structure was being dismantled. The rebellion fodder, as I'd thought of the neighbors, were now empowered, demanding accountability, demanding reform. The visual of Jenkins being led away in handcuffs after his initial bail was revoked due to the severity of the new charges became an iconic image of the downfall. The local corruption ties, the network of complicit businesses and individuals who had benefited from Jenkins's reign, were now being meticulously exposed through the documents we had seized and the testimony of brave whistleblowers. The public embarrassment for Jenkins and his cohorts was total. Their carefully crafted image of community leadership was replaced by the stark reality of their criminality. The climactic confrontation wasn't a single event, but this unfolding public shaming, this wave of outrage and demand for justice that swept through the community. The HOA, as an entity, was in ruins, its authority shattered, its finances frozen. The power they had wielded with such arrogance was gone, exposed as a hollow charade. The fear they had instilled was replaced by a righteous fury, a community finally waking up to the extent of its betrayal. The process of healing would be long, but the first, most crucial step, the exposure of the truth, had been taken. The wheels of justice, though sometimes slow, grind exceedingly fine. Arthur Jenkins and 3 of his closest associates on the HOA board were formally indicted on a raft of charges. The evidence we had compiled, the financial records meticulously analyzed by Bill, the witness testimonies gathered by Ramirez, the internal documents detailing their criminal conspiracy, was overwhelming. Jenkins, stripped of his bluster and his ill-gotten authority, attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but given the severity of the charges, especially the elder abuse counts related to his targeting of Mrs. Henderson and others, the prosecutor's office, with my full support, held firm. We wanted accountability, not just a slap on the wrist. The trials, when they eventually occurred, were relatively swift. The defense had little to offer against the mountain of evidence. Jenkins's lawyer tried to paint him as a man who simply got carried away with his duties, a community leader who made some mistakes. The jury didn't buy it. The image of him threatening me with his makeshift HOA police at my lake cabin, coupled with the cold, hard facts of his financial crimes and predatory behavior, was too potent. Jenkins was found guilty on almost all counts. The judge, citing the egregious abuse of trust and the calculated cruelty of his actions, handed down a sentence that ensured significant jail time. It wasn't life, but it was enough to send a clear message. This kind of corruption would not be tolerated in Rockwood County. His key accomplices also received custodial sentences, though somewhat lighter than Jenkins's. The HOA itself was placed under temporary receivership by the county, its bylaws overhauled, its finances put under strict scrutiny. New elections were held, and this time, the residents, now fully awakened and engaged, chose leaders committed to transparency and genuine community service. The legal aftermath extended beyond the criminal convictions. Civil suits were filed by residents who had been defrauded or unfairly targeted, seeking restitution for their losses. The reign of the Willow Creek Bluffs tyrants was well and truly over. For me, there was a somber resilience in witnessing this conclusion. It had started as a personal affront, an attack on my sanctuary, but it had quickly become a duty, a responsibility to protect the people I was sworn to serve. The cold, calculated vengeance had transformed into a methodical application of the law. There was a moral cost to it all. The grim realization of how easily power can corrupt, how vulnerable communities can be to those who exploit trust. The police department had done its job, meticulously and professionally. The system, for all its imperfections, had worked. The initial shock of guns pointed at me had faded, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of justice delivered, not just for me, but for an entire community that had suffered in silence for too long. The jail time for Jenkins was more than a punishment. It was a restoration of order, a reaffirmation that no one, no matter how powerful they believe themselves to be, is above the law. The lake cabin stands quiet now, the scent of pine and damp earth undisturbed by the acrid smell of misplaced authority. The new shutters, the ones that sparked the initial, ludicrous confrontation, are the exact shade of forest green I wanted. My private property feels private again, a sanctuary restored. The porch light, a simple beacon, now burns with a warmth that feels earned, a return to control not just over a piece of land, but over a principle. The locked gate at the end of my driveway isn't just a physical barrier. It's a symbol of psychological closure, a line drawn against the kind of petty tyranny that, if left unchecked, can fester into something far more malignant. There's a new fence along one stretch of the property line. Not a spite fence, but a clear demarcation. A quiet statement of boundaries respected and defended. It's a good fence, solid, built to last, much like the conviction that drove me to see this through. The tactical ops metaphor for the legal strategy we employed seems apt in retrospect. We identified the threat, gathered intelligence, planned our engagement, and executed with precision. The local corruption ties exposed through those reams of documents were like cutting the enemy's supply lines. The entire operation, from that first shocking encounter with the HOA police to the final sentencing of Jenkins, was a campaign fought not with bullets, but with binders full of evidence, with a relentless adherence to due process. My family, my emotional anchor, can visit the cabin now without the shadow of that conflict hanging over us. The legacy my grandfather built is secure, not just for me, but for the next generation. There's a quiet satisfaction in that, a protective loyalty fulfilled. Sometimes, late at night, when the only sound is the lapping of the lake against the shore, I reflect on the whole sordid affair. Righteous fury has mellowed into a somber resilience. The bloodshed was metaphorical, the blood of trust betrayed, of community bonds broken by greed, but the cost was real. It took a toll on the residents of Willow Creek Bluffs, and it took a toll on my faith in basic decency, though that faith is slowly being rebuilt by the actions of the newly reformed HOA. Occasionally, I indulge in a moment of dry, deadpan wit, musing that perhaps all HOA presidents should be required to undergo a background check by the actual sheriff. It's a fleeting thought, of course. The reality is that vigilance is the true price of peace, in communities large and small. They crossed a line that day. Those self-styled cops with their ill-fitting vests and their exaggerated sense of power. They tried to kick me out, unaware that they were not just challenging a property owner, but the very fabric of the law I embody as the county's sheriff. They learned their lesson. And perhaps, just perhaps, others will too. You won't believe what happened, some might say. But I was there. I made it happen. And I'd do it again.